You wake up to the sound of church bells echoing through the morning mist. But this isn't the peaceful awakening you might imagine. Those bells aren't calling you to prayer. They're announcing that today is the day your childhood dies forever. You're about to enter into what history remembers as holy matrimony, but what you're actually walking into is a legal contract that will strip away every freedom you've ever known and transform you into human property. Welcome to medieval marriage, where love was a luxury nobody could afford, and survival was the only goal that mattered. If you think modern relationships are complicated, wait until you discover what it really meant to say "I do" in the Middle Ages. Because everything you think you know about marriage, everything you've seen in movies or read in fairy tales, is a beautiful lie that masks one of history's most brutal institutions. I'm about to take you on a journey through time to show you exactly why you wouldn't survive a marriage in medieval times. We're not talking about inconveniences like no electricity or running water. We're talking about a system so fundamentally different from anything we understand today that it would break your mind before it broke your body. And trust me, it would definitely break your body. Before we dive into this dark chapter of human history, if you're fascinated by the hidden truths that shaped our world, hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. It's incredible that we can explore these ancient stories together, connected across time and space, by our shared curiosity about how people really lived, loved, and died in the past. Now, here's what makes this video different from anything else you'll watch about medieval history. I'm not just going to tell you facts and dates. I'm going to show you exactly what would happen to you, step by step, if you were transported back to medieval Europe and forced to navigate the marriage system that dominated life for over 1,000 years. By the end of this series, you'll understand why this institution was so powerful that it shaped entire civilizations, and so devastating that it destroyed countless lives. But first, let me shatter the biggest myth about medieval marriage. You've probably heard that people back then married for love just like we do today, or that arranged marriages were rare exceptions for the wealthy. That's completely wrong. Medieval marriage had absolutely nothing to do with love, romance, or personal choice. It was a business transaction, a political alliance, and a breeding program all rolled into one terrifying package. The average age when girls were married off in medieval Europe was between 12 and 14 years old. Not because they were considered adults, but because they were considered old enough to bear children and young enough to be completely controlled by their new owners. Yes, owners. Because that's exactly what husbands were under medieval law. They didn't just marry their wives, they purchased them, owned them, and had the legal right to do whatever they wanted with them. Imagine being 12 years old and waking up one morning to discover that your parents have already negotiated your sale to a complete stranger. You've never met this person, never spoken to them, never even seen them. But in a few hours, you'll be legally bound to them for life. There's no divorce, no escape, no legal protection. The contract has been signed, the money has changed hands, and you are now officially someone else's property. The negotiation process for medieval marriages was exactly like buying livestock. Families would examine the girl's health, her breeding potential, her family bloodline, and her dowry value. They'd check her teeth, assess her fertility, and evaluate her ability to produce male heirs. The girl herself had no say in any of this. She was the product being sold, not a participant in the transaction. And here's the part that would absolutely destroy you if you were transported back to medieval times. The concept of consent didn't exist. Not just for marriage, but for anything that happened afterward. Medieval law stated clearly that a wife's body belonged to her husband. She had no right to refuse his advances, no right to control when or how often she became pregnant, no right to medical care during childbirth. She was a breeding machine with no off switch. The wedding ceremony itself was designed to make this transfer of ownership as public and irreversible as possible. Unlike modern weddings, medieval marriages weren't primarily religious events. They were legal contracts witnessed by the entire community. The bride wasn't walking down the aisle to meet her beloved. She was being delivered to her new owner like a piece of valuable merchandise. The church's role in medieval marriage was minimal and mostly focused on blessing the arrangement after the real business was done. The priest would offer prayers for fertility and obedience, but the actual marriage contract was negotiated between men, signed by men, and enforced by men. Women were present only as the subject of the transaction, not as participants in it. Now, let me explain what would happen to you personally if you were caught in this system. First, your education would stop immediately. Medieval wives weren't supposed to be educated beyond basic household management. Reading and writing were considered dangerous skills that might give women ideas about independence. Your job wasn't to think, it was to obey. Second, your economic independence would disappear completely. Medieval women couldn't own property, couldn't sign contracts, couldn't inherit wealth, couldn't even make purchases without their husband's permission. Every coin you earned, every piece of clothing you wore, every morsel of food you ate belonged to your husband. You would become entirely dependent on someone else's goodwill for your basic survival. Third, your physical autonomy would vanish. Your husband would have the legal right to beat you, confine you, or force you into sexual acts whenever he pleased. Medieval law actually specified that a husband could discipline his wife with a stick as long as it was no thicker than his thumb. That's where the expression rule of thumb comes from, by the way. It's a measurement for how severely you were allowed to beat your wife. But perhaps the most psychologically devastating aspect of medieval marriage was the complete isolation it created. You would be cut off from your family, your friends, and anyone who might offer emotional support. Medieval wives were expected to transfer their loyalty completely to their new household. Your old relationships would be severed, and your new relationships would be entirely controlled by your husband. The living conditions you'd face would be harsh beyond imagination. Most medieval homes were dark, cold, and crowded. Privacy didn't exist. You'd be sharing living space with your husband's family, servants, and often strangers who needed shelter. Every aspect of your daily life would be observed, judged, and controlled by people who saw you as an investment that needed to produce returns. Your daily routine would be backbreaking labor from dawn until dusk. You'd be responsible for cooking, cleaning, spinning, weaving, managing servants, entertaining guests, and caring for children, all while maintaining the perfect demeanor of a submissive and grateful wife. Any sign of unhappiness, rebellion, or independent thought would be met with punishment that could range from public humiliation to physical violence. The medical care available to medieval women was primitive and often more dangerous than no treatment at all. During pregnancy and childbirth, which would happen frequently and without any form of birth control, you'd be attended by midwives whose knowledge was based on superstition and folk remedies. The mortality rate for women in childbirth was staggering, and surviving one birth just meant you'd be expected to risk your life again as soon as possible. The psychological pressure of medieval marriage was designed to break your spirit completely. You'd be taught that your suffering was not only normal, but virtuous. The church would tell you that pain was God's punishment for Eve's sin, and that your only path to salvation was through complete submission to male authority. Any attempt to assert your own needs or desires would be labeled as sinful pride that needed to be crushed. This system wasn't an accident or a historical aberration. It was a carefully constructed machine designed to extract maximum value from women's labor and reproductive capacity while minimizing their ability to resist or escape. Every law, every custom, every religious teaching worked together to ensure that women remained powerless and men remained in control. The economic foundations of this system were built on the concept of women as valuable property that could be bought, sold, and traded to create political alliances and consolidate wealth. The dowry system, inheritance laws, and marriage contracts all function to ensure that women remained economically dependent and therefore controllable. But here's where it gets even more twisted. The few legal protections that existed for medieval women were actually designed to protect the husband's investment, not the woman herself. If someone assaulted a married woman, they weren't prosecuted for harming her. They were prosecuted for damaging another man's property. The compensation went to the husband, not the victim. You weren't a person with rights, you were an asset with a price tag. The social enforcement of this system was ruthless and comprehensive. Every person in your community would be watching, judging, and reporting on your behavior. Neighbors would monitor whether you were properly submissive to your husband. Servants would report any signs of disobedience. Even other women trapped in the same system would police each other's behavior because stepping out of line meant risking everything. And if you think you could just run away and start over somewhere else, think again. Medieval Europe was a network of interconnected communities where everyone knew everyone else's business. A woman traveling alone would be immediately suspect. You'd have no money, no legal identity, and no way to support yourself. Within days, you'd be captured and returned to your husband to face punishment that would make you wish you'd never tried to escape. The psychological warfare was constant and sophisticated. You'd be told repeatedly that your husband was being generous by providing for you, that you should be grateful for his protection, that any suffering you experienced was your own fault for not being a good enough wife. This gaslighting was so systematic that many women actually believed it, internalizing the idea that they deserved whatever treatment they received. The breeding expectations would crush your body and spirit simultaneously. Medieval families needed many children because infant mortality was catastrophic. You'd be expected to become pregnant immediately after marriage and to continue bearing children until your body simply couldn't survive another pregnancy. The average medieval woman who lived to adulthood would endure 8 to 10 pregnancies, knowing that half of her children would die before reaching age 5. Each pregnancy would be a gamble with death. Without understanding of hygiene, nutrition, or basic medical care, complications were common and often fatal. You'd watch friends and neighbors die in childbirth regularly, knowing that the same fate likely awaited you, but there was no choice in the matter. Your body wasn't yours to control. The winter months would be particularly brutal. Food shortages were common, and wives were expected to eat last and least. You'd give the best portions to your husband and children while surviving on scraps. Malnutrition would weaken your immune system, making you vulnerable to the diseases that swept through medieval communities like wildfire. The religious pressure would be overwhelming and inescapable. Medieval Christianity taught that women were inherently sinful and needed constant supervision. You'd be required to confess your thoughts to a priest who would report back to your husband about your spiritual state. Your prayers would be monitored, your devotions evaluated, and your religious observances used as another tool of control. But perhaps the most devastating aspect of this entire system was how it destroyed the possibility of genuine human connection. Your relationship with your husband couldn't be based on love, trust, or mutual respect, because the power dynamic made those impossible. You'd be living with someone who owned you, who could hurt you without consequence, who saw you as a useful tool rather than a human being. The impact on your mental health would be catastrophic. Modern psychology recognizes that the conditions of medieval marriage would create severe trauma, depression, and what we now call learned helplessness. You'd develop survival mechanisms that involve completely suppressing your own personality, desires, and instincts. You'd become a shadow of yourself, going through the motions of life while your actual self slowly died inside. The legal system provided no recourse for wives who suffered abuse. In fact, the law actively protected abusive husbands. A man who killed his wife in a fit of rage might face some legal consequences, but a man who beat, raped, or psychologically tortured his wife was simply exercising his legal rights. The courts would side with the husband in virtually every dispute, no matter how clear the evidence of his wrongdoing. The economic exploitation would be total and permanent. Every hour of labor you performed, every skill you developed, every valuable item you created would belong to your husband. You'd work constantly but never earn anything. You'd contribute enormously to your household's wealth, but never own a single coin. You'd be simultaneously essential to the family's survival and completely expendable if you failed to meet expectations. The social isolation would eat away at your sanity. You'd be surrounded by people but unable to form genuine friendships because every relationship would be mediated through your husband's authority. You couldn't visit friends without permission, couldn't receive visitors without supervision, couldn't even write letters without your husband reading them first. You'd be alone in the most fundamental way possible. The cultural messaging would reinforce your powerlessness at every turn. Songs, stories, and religious teachings would all emphasize that women's suffering was natural and necessary. You'd be told that your pain was proof of your virtue, that your submission was evidence of your godliness, that your silence was a sign of your wisdom. The entire culture would gaslight you into believing that your oppression was actually your salvation. And here's the truly horrifying part that would break your modern mind completely. This wasn't considered cruel or unusual. This was normal. This was expected. This was how society functioned for hundreds of years. Millions of women lived and died in this system, and it was considered not just acceptable, but morally necessary for social stability. The children born into this system would learn that this was how relationships worked. Sons would learn that they had the right to absolute authority over women. Daughters would learn that they had no rights at all. The cycle would perpetuate itself generation after generation, with each new group of children accepting as normal what we would recognize as systematic abuse. The most chilling realization is that this system worked exactly as designed. It wasn't broken or flawed, it was functioning perfectly to achieve its true purpose, which was never about love, family, or human happiness. It was about power, control, and the systematic extraction of value from half the human population. Your modern brain would struggle to comprehend the completeness of this oppression. Every avenue of escape would be blocked. Every source of hope would be extinguished. Every spark of independence would be crushed before it could grow into something dangerous. You'd be trapped not just by law or custom, but by the complete absence of any alternative way to exist. The psychological conditioning would be so thorough that even if someone offered you freedom, you might not be able to take it. After years of being told you were incapable of making decisions, you genuinely believe it. After years of being punished for independent thought, you'd stop thinking independently. After years of being treated as property, you'd start to see yourself that way. This is why medieval marriage was so much more than just a difficult relationship. It was a form of human domestication that reduced women to the level of livestock. Valuable livestock, certainly, but livestock nonetheless. The breeding programs, the ownership transfers, the complete control over movement and behavior, all of it designed to maximize productivity while minimizing resistance. The records that survive from medieval times tell us about property transfers and legal disputes, but they're almost silent about the human cost. The women who lived through this system left behind no memoirs, no letters, no record of their inner lives. They were erased from history as completely as they were erased from life, their stories lost in the silence that patriarchal society demanded. What makes this even more terrifying is how recently this system existed. We're not talking about ancient history here. This was how marriage worked in Europe just a few centuries ago. The legal frameworks that enabled this oppression persisted in modified forms well into the modern era. Some of the attitudes and assumptions that made it possible still echo in our culture today. The The transformation from medieval marriage to modern marriage didn't happen overnight or through gradual enlightenment. It required centuries of struggle, rebellion, and sacrifice by women who refused to accept their designated role as property. Every right that women enjoy today was fought for and won against fierce resistance from people who believed the medieval system was natural and necessary. But here's what should truly terrify you about medieval marriage. It wasn't an accident of history or a temporary aberration. It was a logical outcome of organizing society around male dominance and female subordination. When you give one group of people absolute power over another group, this is what happens. The brutality wasn't a bug in the system, it was a feature. The economic incentives were perfectly aligned to maintain this oppression. Men benefited from free labor, unlimited sexual access, and complete control over reproduction. Families benefited from political alliances and property consolidation. The church benefited from a population that accepted suffering as divine will. The only people who didn't benefit were the women themselves, and their voices didn't matter. Understanding medieval marriage isn't just about learning historical facts. It's about recognizing how quickly human societies can normalize the most extreme forms of oppression when it serves the interests of those in power. It's about understanding that the rights and freedoms we take for granted today are not natural or inevitable. They're recent achievements that required tremendous sacrifice to win and constant vigilance to maintain. The women who survived medieval marriage weren't weak or compliant. They were incredibly strong people who found ways to endure unimaginable circumstances. They developed survival strategies, found moments of joy in the darkest situations, and somehow managed to pass down to their daughters the knowledge that they deserved better, even when the entire world told them otherwise. Their stories matter because they remind us that human dignity and the desire for freedom are indestructible. No system of oppression, no matter how complete or long-lasting, can entirely crush the human spirit. The women who lived through medieval marriage left us a legacy of resilience that echoes across the centuries. So the next time you hear someone romanticize the past or claim that traditional marriage was somehow better than modern relationships, remember what traditional marriage actually looked like. Remember the 12-year-old girls sold to strangers, the women who died in childbirth, bearing children they never chose to conceive, the generations of human beings who lived and died as property. We've come so far from those dark days, but the distance we've traveled makes the journey back seem impossible. It's not. Human societies can slide backward just as easily as they move forward. The rights that seem permanent today can disappear tomorrow if we're not vigilant about protecting them. The story of medieval marriage is ultimately a story about the power of systems to shape human behavior and the importance of questioning those systems, no matter how normal they seem. It's a reminder that just because something has always been done a certain way doesn't mean it's right, natural, or inevitable. As you go about your modern life, enjoying freedoms that medieval women couldn't even imagine, remember their sacrifice. Remember that your ability to choose your own partner, to leave an unhappy relationship, to control your own body and future, these aren't just personal freedoms. They're victories won through centuries of struggle against systems designed to deny your humanity. The medieval marriage system is dead, but its ghost still haunts our world in subtle ways. Every time someone suggests that women are naturally suited for submission, every time someone romanticizes traditional gender roles, every time someone argues that women's rights have gone too far, they're channeling the same attitudes that made medieval marriage possible. The best way to honor the women who suffered through medieval marriage is to never forget their stories and never take our freedoms for granted. Because the moment we stop fighting for equality and human dignity is the moment we risk sliding back toward the darkness they endured. History has a way of repeating itself, but only if we let it. The choice is ours.